Welcome loneliness as superpower, the solitary path to dominance in solitude, where we are least alone. Lord Byron, the question that haunts us all, picture this. It's 2 a.m. The world is asleep. You're awake, alone with your thoughts, and for the first time all day, you feel clear, focused, powerful. No notifications, no small talk, no performance, just you and the work that matters. But then morning comes. Society tells you this is wrong. Humans are social creatures, they say. Isolation is unhealthy. You need people. And so you force yourself back into the noise, wondering why that clarity vanished the moment you rejoined the crowd. What if they have it backwards? What if your most powerful self doesn't emerge in the company of others, but in their absence? Today, we're exploring one of philosophy's most dangerous and seductive ideas, loneliness as superpower. The belief that all meaningful transformation happens not despite isolation, but because of it. That the crowd doesn't elevate it, dilutes. That solitude doesn't weaken it, concentrates. This isn't about being antisocial. It's about understanding a profound truth that the greatest minds in history discovered. The path to dominance is walked alone. The philosophy, isolation as forged the core premise, is deceptively simple. Meaningful transformation requires separation from the collective. Think about every major breakthrough in your life. The moment you finally figured out your career direction, the insight that changed how you see relationships, the skill you mastered that set you apart. Now ask yourself honestly, did those breakthroughs happen at a party, in a crowded office, during endless group chats, or did they happen in the quiet, in the space between you and your thoughts, where no one else's opinions could interfere? This philosophy argues that the crowd, with all its noise, expectations, and groupthink, is fundamentally incompatible with genuine growth. Every person you add to your environment dilutes your focus. Every opinion you consider beyond your own delays your decision. Every moment spent managing social dynamics is a moment stolen from the work that transforms you. The crowd is comfortable. Solitude is where you evolve. The research, what science reveals. Before we dive into the philosophers, let's ground this in hard data. Because modern neuroscience and psychology have discovered something remarkable. The isolated brain functions differently and in some ways superiorly. The neuroscience of solitude. Dr. Netta Weinstein's research at the University of Rochester found that solitude enhances emotional regulation and stress recovery. When participants spent time alone, truly alone, not just physically isolated but mentally unplugged, their cortisol levels dropped significantly. But here's what's fascinating. This only worked when the solitude was chosen, not imposed. The brain in chosen solitude enters what researchers call default mode network activation state, where the prefrontal cortex can process complex problems without external interference. This is the neural basis of deep work, of breakthrough thinking, of the insights that change everything. A 2017 study published in Nature by Matthew Lieberman showed that our brains can either be in social mode or analytical mode, but not both simultaneously. When we're engaged with others, the brain's social networks light up, suppressing the regions responsible for deep, systematic thinking. The inverse is also true. Genuine analytical breakthrough requires the social brain to go quiet. Translation: your brain literally cannot think its deepest thoughts while managing social interaction. The creativity-solitude connection. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the psychologist who pioneered flow state research, studied 91 exceptionally creative individuals across fields: artists, scientists, entrepreneurs. His finding: nearly all of them were either introverted or had developed elaborate routines to protect solitary work time. But it went deeper. The creative breakthroughs didn't just require some alone time. They required what Csikszentmihalyi called psychological isolation, the ability to disconnect not just physically but mentally from the concerns, judgments, and frameworks of others. Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple, put it bluntly: most inventors and engineers I've met are like me. They re-shy and they live in their heads. They're almost like artists. In fact, the best of them are artists, and artists work best alone. The dark side. When isolation becomes exile. But here's where it gets complex. The same research shows a J-curve relationship between solitude and well-being. Moderate, chosen solitude enhances creativity, emotional regulation, and self-awareness. But extended, unchosen isolation, what psychologists call chronic loneliness, is correlated with cognitive decline, depression, and even increased mortality risk. A meta-analysis by Julianne Holt-Lundstedt found that chronic loneliness increases mortality risk by 26%, comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The University College London's longitudinal study tracked 10,000 individuals and found that sustained social isolation led to measurable decreases in cognitive function over time. The critical variable, choice and meaning. When isolation is chosen in service of a goal, artistic creation, intellectual work, skill mastery, the brain interprets it as purposeful sacrifice. When isolation is imposed or meaningless, the brain interprets it as rejection and threat. This is the razor's edge we're walking. The philosophy of loneliness as superpower works, but only if you're wielding it with intention, not stumbling into it through avoidance. The philosophers, voices from the mountain. Now let us turn to the thinkers who built their entire worldviews on this principal land, whose lives embodied both its power and its cost. Søren Kierkegaard. The crowd is untruth. Danish philosopher. Søren Kierkegaard lived most of his life in deliberate social exile. His famous declaration, "The crowd is untruth." Kierkegaard wasn't making a casual observation. He was diagnosing a spiritual disease. In his view, when individuals merge into crowds, whether physical mobs or ideological movements, they abdicate individual responsibility. The crowd thinks in slogans. The crowd acts without reflection. The crowd dilutes individual conscience until everyone is responsible for everything, which means no one is responsible for anything. He wrote, "There is a view of life which conceives that, where the crowd is, there also is the truth, and that in truth itself there is need of having the crowd on its side. There is another view of life which conceives that wherever there is a crowd, there is untruth." For Kierkegaard, genuine selfhood, what he called becoming a self before God, required separation from collective opinion. You cannot discover who you truly are while performing for an audience. The audience will always corrupt the discovery with its expectations, its judgments, its need for you to be comprehensible to them. His life reflected this philosophy. He broke off his engagement to Regine Olsen, the only woman he loved, because he believed marriage would compromise his philosophical mission. He endured public mockery from satirical newspapers. He died relatively young, isolated, insisting to the end that the crowd was the enemy of truth. Was he right? Or did his philosophy become a self-fulfilling prophecy of isolation? Friedrich Nietzsche, Zarathustra's mountain. If Kierkegaard diagnosed the problem, Nietzsche prescribed the cure through his literary alter ego. Zarathustra in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche's prophet philosopher spends 10 years alone on a mountain, accumulating wisdom like honey. Only after this decade of solitude does he descend to share his insights with humanity. But even then, he repeatedly returns to the mountain, because the marketplace, the crowds where truth goes to die. Nietzsche wrote, "Flee, my friend, into your solitude. I see you deafened by the noise of great men and stung by the stings of little men." For Nietzsche, the crowd represents what he called the herd, humanity organized around mediocrity, resentment, and the suppression of excellence. The herd doesn't want you to become powerful. It wants you to stay comfortable, comprehensible, controllable. The Bermensch Nietzsche's vision of the superior human is fundamentally solitary, not because he hates people, but because his values, his goals, his very mode of existence cannot be validated by the crowd. He must create his own values in isolation from collective morality. Nietzsche himself lived this philosophy to its tragic conclusion. He spent his final productive years in boarding houses and rented rooms, often alone for weeks, his health deteriorating, writing works that wouldn't be understood for decades. His final lucid act was collapsing in the street while embracing a horse being beaten by its owner, a moment of compassion that marked the end of his sanity. He achieved intellectual dominance, but at what cost? Arthur Schopenhauer, The Hedgehog's Dilemma. Schopenhauer offered perhaps the most pessimistic and psychologically acute analysis of human connection through his famous Hedgehog's Dilemma. "Imagine hedgehogs in winter," he said. "They need each other's warmth to survive, so they huddle together. But their spines hurt each other, so they separate. They get cold, so they huddle again. They get hurt, so they separate. The cycle continues. Forever too close brings pain, too far brings death." Schopenhauer's conclusion: the optimal human distance is polite indifference. Close enough to function, far enough to avoid the inevitable wounds of intimacy. His prescription: a man can be himself only so long as he is alone. And if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom. For it is only when he is alone that he is really free. Schopenhauer never married. He had few friends. He lived with a succession of poodles, all named the same thing. He achieved philosophical influence, but died essentially alone. His philosophy, an elaborate justification for his temperament. The contemporary voice, Cal Newport's deep work. Fast forward to today. Cal Newport, computer science professor and productivity researcher, has repackaged these ancient insights for the digital age through his concept of deep work. Newport's research shows that in our hyper-connected economy, the ability to focus without distraction has become simultaneously more rare and more valuable. Those who can isolate themselves from the constant demands of shallow communication, meetings, Slack, social media produce work of exponentially higher quality, he writes. To remain valuable in our economy, you must master the art of quickly learning complicated things. This task requires deep work. If you don't cultivate this ability, you're likely to fall behind as technology advances. Newport himself practices office hours where he's available and is completely unreachable outside them. No social media, no instant messaging. Extended periods where his calendar simply says, deep work. The modern version of Zarathustra's mountain is a closed door, disabled notifications, and the courage to disappoint people's expectations of your availability. To practice. How dominance emerges from solitude. So how does this actually work? How does isolation translate to power? 1. Undiluted focus creates mastery when you work in solitude. You're not managing impressions, navigating social dynamics, or fragmenting attention across multiple consciousnesses. Every cognitive resource goes toward the work itself. Anders Ericsson's research on deliberate practice, the foundation of Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000-hour rule, showed that elite performers across all fields shared one habit: extended periods of solitary, focused practice, not group practice, not social learning. Alone, with the skill, pushing past comfort, the violinist doesn't achieve mastery in orchestral rehearsals. They achieve it in the practice room, alone, repeating the same passage until muscle memory becomes art. 2. Psychological independence breeds original thought. Solomon Ash's famous conformity experiments showed that people will deny the evidence of their own eyes if a group disagrees with them. The social pressure to conform is neurologically hardwired, takes conscious effort to resist. But here's what's profound. The pressure doesn't exist in solitude. When you're alone, you have no one to please, no consensus to maintain, no social capital to protect. You can think thoughts that would get you ostracized. You can question assumptions everyone else accepts. You can be intellectually honest because there's no social cost. This is why revolutionary ideas rarely emerge from committees. They emerge from individuals willing to think alone, long enough to see what others miss. 3. Emotional self-sufficiency eliminates manipulation. Every relationship is, at some level, a negotiation. You give validation, you receive it. You offer belonging, you get security. There's nothing wrong with this. It's how humans function. But it also means that people who need social connection are inherently manipulable. Threaten their belonging, and they'll compromise. Promise acceptance, and they'll conform. The person who has genuinely learned to be psychologically complete in solitude, they cannot be manipulated through social pressure. They don't need your approval. They don't fear your rejection. They make decisions based on internal metrics, not external validation. This is the dominance, the philosophy. Promise is not domination over others, but immunity to being dominated. The warning, where this philosophy breaks, but we need to be brutally honest about where this goes wrong. The avoidance trap. Some people embrace solitude not as a tool for growth, but as an escape from growth. Social interaction is challenging. It requires vulnerability, communication skill, emotional regulation. Hiding in isolation and calling it philosophical is just sophisticated avoidance. The question to ask yourself, are you alone because you're building something that requires it? Or are you alone because facing people is uncomfortable? One is strategic, the other is fear dressed as philosophy. The echo chamber of one Nietzsche went insane. Kierkegaard died bitter. Schopenhauer was famously difficult. Extended isolation can create a feedback loop where your own thoughts amplify without external correction. You need some friction against your ideas, some challenge to your assumptions. Absolute solitude can lead to intellectual stagnation, disguised as depth. Become so internally consistent that you lose the ability to recognize when you're wrong. The meaning paradox. Viktor Frankl's research on meaning showed that purpose is often relational. We find meaning in service to others, in creation for others, in connection with others. Pure isolation can strip life of the very meaning that makes the struggle worthwhile. Many who embrace radical solitude discover that achievement without anyone to share it with feels hollow. Mastery without application feels pointless. The mountain is clarifying, but you eventually need to descend.